Welcome back to the deep dive. Our mission here is always to take these complex, often um, overlooked realities and really break them down into insights that you can use, right away.
Exactly.
And today, we're stepping right into the heart of the classroom. Specifically, we're looking at those really vulnerable transition points where a student who is high achieving, capable, the one you absolutely expect to succeed, suddenly, and you just can't explain it, they hit a wall.
It's a reality every single teacher who works with transitioning students has to fit. You see it all the time. You have the student who is genuinely brilliant, right? The one who can talk about the concepts beautifully. You have a conversation with them and they just get it. But then when the time comes for a structured assessment,
The test.
yeah, the quiz, the final exam, the formal project, they freeze, they get anxious, they withdraw, they become silent. I've even seen kids show physical symptoms of stress, and this is after they were confident performers just weeks earlier in their old school.
And as aspiring teachers, I think our first instinct, what we're trained to do is to look for a content gap. We think, oh, maybe they missed a topic, or perhaps their old school didn't cover this module.
We look for a failure of curriculum.
Or a gap in their intelligence, which is even worse.
Right. But our sources, and this is from a deep analysis of educational systems across the subcontinent and really globally, they point to something much more profound. It's critically psychological. Today, we're looking at a phenomenon we're calling assessment shock.
Assessment shock.
And it is, to be blunt, a psychological trauma that's just disguised as an academic failing.
That is a very powerful distinction.
It is, and this deep dive is all about recognizing that shock and, more importantly, empowering you to teach consciously to help mitigate it. Because here's the hard truth we all need to internalize.
Okay.
Most children do not fail curriculum transitions. They fail assessment transitions.
So they know the material.
They know the material, but they don't know the new rules of being judged. And our goal today is to equip you to look past the syllabus, past that surface level report card, and actually address the real source of that student's anxiety.
I see that confusion all the time with mentors and parents. When a student moves, say, from a state board to CBSE or from CBSE into an IB system, the immediate reaction is just to obsess over the syllabi.
Oh, completely. They get out the textbooks, they start comparing chapters.
Exactly. They analyze the teaching methods. Does the new school use more projects? Is it less lecture-based? The entire focus is on the content and the instructional shift.
But the one thing they almost always miss, the unasked question that truly determines whether that student will succeed or fail in the new environment, is about the assessment culture.
The assessment culture. What do you mean by that exactly?
It's so much more than just the structure of the test. It's about how learning is actually measured. It's about how mistakes are treated in the classroom. Are they visible? Are they punished? And maybe most importantly, it's about how pressure, both internal and external, is applied to that student's work.
So this isn't something that's written down in the school's mission statement. It's more like a silent operating system.
Precisely. You've hit it right there. It acts as a silent curriculum. And honestly, it's far more influential than any textbook. The assessment culture dictates a child's entire psychological landscape in your classroom.
Their confidence.
Their confidence levels, their baseline anxiety, their willingness to take an intellectual risk, and their overall fear of failure. So if the old culture said silence and compliance are safe, and the new culture is telling them experimentation and reflection are mandatory, that child is just. They're thrown into complete psychological confusion.
So even if the subject matter, calculus or history, is the same.
Even if the core content is identical, when these fundamental rules of engagement change overnight, panic sets in. The student doesn't just feel academically challenged, they feel psychologically destabilized. They've literally lost the map to success.
Okay, let's unpack that. Let's get into the psychology of it. Assessment isn't just a grade, it's a communication tool. What are some of those non-academic messages it's sending to a child that we as teachers need to be so aware of?
Well, we have to start by acknowledging that every assessment is just loaded with implicit psychological messaging. It tells a child what really matters in that classroom.
For instance,
does the system reward speed? Getting through 10 problems in 30 minutes? Or does it reward depth spending those same 30 minutes, really synthesizing a complex argument? Does it value memorization over actual application?
So it signals what's rewarded.
It signals what is rewarded, maybe a single, perfectly formatted answer. And just as critically, it signals what is punished. Things like deviation from the norm, speculation, messy work, or, and this is the most damaging one, simply making a mistake.
That distinction right there, what's rewarded versus what's punished, that brings us to what feels like the core psychological tension in any classroom. The conflict between be careful and be curious.
This is maybe the most important framework for any aspiring teacher to really grasp. If your assessment system is designed to heavily punish any deviation, I mean, only one precise right answer gets credit and everything else is just wrong, the child learns this overwhelming mandate: be careful.
And that student becomes risk-averse.
Totally. They won't raise their hand with a speculative idea. They will absolutely avoid the challenging open-ended question. Their entire focus becomes mirroring the expected outcome that they think the teacher or the textbook wants.
And you see that play out instantly. A be careful student, if you give them an optional, difficult bonus question that requires some real critical thought, they'll almost always skip it, even with extra time.
Of course they will. Why? Because just attempting it carries the psychological risk of failure, of showing the teacher they don't know something, even if there's no penalty to their score.
They're prioritizing safety.
They're prioritizing safety over intellectual exploration. Their goal is security, predictability.
But on the other hand, if the assessment rewards exploration, if it values reflection on the process and sees risk-taking as just data for improvement, then the child is conditioned to be curious.
Exactly. In that environment, the student sees the assessment not as some final judgment on their intellect, but as a checkpoint.
A point of reflection.
A point of reflection before the next piece of work. They understand that learning it's a cycle. They get praised not just for the final answer, but for the depth of their questions, the complexity of their research, maybe the originality of their argument. Failure gets reframed. It becomes, okay, what did this attempt teach me?
I think that raises a huge question for all of us in education then. If we design our lessons, we're always preaching curiosity and intellectual courage, but then by the way we grade, we end up rewarding cautious performance.
It's the moment the mask drops, isn't it?
Yeah.
The grading scheme is the truest indicator of what we actually value. Now, to diagnose where a student's anxiety is coming from during one of these transitions, which is really just a transition between two different psychological conditioning programs, we need to understand the structural dimensions of the pressure they're used to.
And our sources highlight three of these, three crucial dimensions of pressure that combine in different ways in every system.
Yes, and mastering these three dimensions, frequency, finality, and visibility, is really the key to understanding this conditioning mismatch we're trying to fix.
So the first one is frequency. This is just how often is the student being formally judged?
Is the feedback continuous? Are there daily or weekly check-ins, lots of low-stakes quizzes, ongoing assignments? Or is it all spaced out, happening just once or twice a semester?
And that frequency determines the student's pace of performance, right?
Absolutely. High frequency means they're always in performance mode. They're perpetually managing that cognitive load. Low frequency, on the other hand, allows for long periods of unstructured learning, but it demands this intense, high focus right at the moment of measurement.
Okay, the second dimension is finality. This is about how much weight one single assessment carries.
Yeah, if a final exam is worth 80% of the entire year's grade, that's extreme finality. That's high stakes.
Versus a system where no single test is worth more than, say, 5%, and you have multiple chances to resubmit, that's low finality.
Low stakes. And finality determines the psychological cost of an error. In a high finality system, one mistake, a bad night's sleep, one moment where your mind just blanks. It can derail months of hard work. The consequences feel immense.
But in a low finality system, mistakes are statistically minimized.
Exactly. The student can view them as just isolated data points. They don't feel like a catastrophe.
And the third one is visibility. Who sees the results? Who sees the process? Is the student's mark posted on a public bulletin board? Is feedback given in front of the whole class?
Or is it a private, focused dialogue between the teacher and that one student, protected from peer judgment? Visibility is what determines the egocentric pressure.
The social pressure.
Social pressure. If success or failure is public, the pressure shifts from learning mastery to social performance. The fear isn't just, I failed, it's everyone saw me fail. Private feedback keeps the focus where it should be, on academic growth.
And this is where that conditioning mismatch you talked about comes from, right?
Yeah.
Different school boards combine these three dimensions in their own unique, psychologically impactful ways over years and years.
Absolutely. The mismatch is the direct source of the shock. So, Take a student who's been conditioned for years by a system with low frequency and high finality. They've learned to pace themselves for one huge single event.
Right.
Then they move to a continuous system. High frequency, low finality. Suddenly they feel like they're being judged constantly. They're overwhelmed by the continuous assessment load. They feel like, I never get to take my armor off.
That pressure shifts from being acute and intense to just pervasive, chronic background noise.
It does, and the reverse is just as jarring. Imagine a student conditioned for continuous feedback, used to all these frequent low-stakes checks. Now they're suddenly facing a massive high-stakes final exam where one test determines their entire fate.
They would just collapse.
They often psychologically collapse under that weight. The high finality is overwhelming because they've never developed the coping mechanisms to manage that kind of intense, concentrated, singular pressure. They weren't trained for it. They have very low resilience to single-point failure.
So the problem really isn't their intelligence or a lack of preparation in, physics or history. It's a profound psychological conditioning mismatch between the old assessment culture and the new one.
Precisely. And as conscious teachers, we have to realize that before we can even teach a new concept from the textbook, we first have to help them unlearn the old assessment rules and internalize the new ones. We have to de-weaponize the tools they're used to and repurpose them as tools for growth.
Okay, let's turn our attention to some of these systems, especially the ones known for historically higher stakes in India. Let's start with the Central Board of Secondary Education, or CBSE, and its current transformation.
Right. Historically, the traditional CBSE mindset was, it was defined by very structured unit tests, predictable term exams, and then the all-important final exams.
Very predictable.
Very predictable. Success was really focused on finding the single correct answer as quickly and efficiently as possible. The pressure was intense, no doubt, but it was predictable. You knew it was coming.
The core skill was study hard, perform on the day.
Exactly. The student's internal mantra was clear. Study hard, perform flawlessly on the day. They knew the exact parameters for success.
But the CBSE system has been going through this massive and I think necessary reform towards competency-based assessment, or CBA. This is supposed to be a huge step forward.
Oh, it is. It's introducing application-based questions, case studies, real-life scenarios. It's demanding higher-order thinking like analysis and synthesis. The goal is clearly to move beyond just rote memorization.
Which is a good thing.
It is an unequivocally positive move. It's about preparing students for a complex, nonlinear world. However, here is where our mentor's insight becomes absolutely critical. Even a positive, progressive reform creates deep psychological stress for the student who was conditioned in the old regime.
So what's the mechanism of that hidden stress? Where does it come from?
For students who excelled in that predictable one right answer world, the sudden demand for application and synthesis creates this profound uncertainty about what's even expected of them. They were experts at finding the exact answer in their notes. Now they have to kind of invent a solution by applying principles.
I remember seeing this shift with my last group of trainees. They could state Newton's 3 laws perfectly. But when I gave them a scenario, like designing a safety mechanism for a roller coaster, they just froze.
Of course.
They were just confused about what a correct answer even looks like in that kind of application context.
Exactly. The source of their anxiety shifts dramatically. It's no longer, do I know the fact, which is a simple knowledge check. It becomes, is my thinking acceptable? Is my interpretation the one the examiner wants? They develop a real fear of open-ended questions because those questions require them to take intellectual ownership and manage ambiguity.
And the anxieties they voice are things like, how much should I write?
How much should I write to satisfy the examiner? Is there some hidden key I'm missing? And, most critically, can I still be wrong even if I followed all the steps logically?
So we have this positive move towards competency, but for the student, competency without transparency creates this massive internal assessment shock.
Precisely. Competency without clarity creates anxiety. And the teacher's role is completely redefined. We have to become the providers of transparent scaffolding. We need to demystify the marking scheme and, crucially, define what acceptable ambiguity looks like. We have to show them how their thinking will be judged, not just what facts they need to include.
Otherwise, they'll just revert to what's safe.
They'll revert to safe, factual recall, and the entire purpose of the CBA reform is defeated.
Let's look at the flip side of that. What happens when a student who's been conditioned by traditional CBSE moves out of that system? say, into an IB curriculum, which is built around continuous assessment?
They struggle. They struggle acutely with continuous grading, with rubric-based marking, and especially with reflection-based feedback.
Why is that so hard for them?
Because their entire psychological conditioning was built around the idea of peaking for 3 major performances a year. They knew the intensity would rise and then it would fall. Suddenly, they're in a high-frequency system where the pressure is always on, and they feel this persistent anxiety of, I'm being judged all the time.
The continuous feedback feels invasive, not supportive.
Exactly. They interpret frequent feedback as constant proof that they're deficient. They think, if I'm constantly being told to improve, then I must constantly be failing. They're associating the grading process with the high-stakes outcome of their past, even when the new grading is low stakes and meant to be formative.
So how do we help them? What's the practical advice for teachers guiding these students?
Well, first, we have to consciously and explicitly normalize ambiguity and uncertainty in learning. We have to teach them that in the real world, there can be multiple valid paths and multiple valid yet incomplete conclusions.
And how do you make that concrete in the classroom?
Second, you have to discuss marking schemes openly. You turn the assessment criteria into a guidance tool, a map for success, not some secret final hurdle. So instead of just handing back a marked paper, you dedicate class time to analyzing the rubric. You say, look, you got a 5 here because your synthesis was weak. Let's look at how we strengthen synthesis for the next one.
And you have to change your language.
You have to change your language. Third, you consciously praise the depth of their thinking and the process they followed, even when the final mark isn't perfect. You have to actively replace that exam-centric language. You need to say over and over, learning is not a performance leading up to an exam. The exam is just a check-in on our learning journey. That reframing is essential.
Okay, let's move to the second high-stakes environment, state boards. The reality there, particularly in many regions, is characterized by an extreme reliance on one single massive annual exam.
And very limited internal or formative assessment. This is the ultimate expression of high finality with low frequency.
And it leads to these extraordinarily high consequence outcomes.
It does. It can determine their entire career trajectory. And the underlying psychological message for a child conditioned in this environment is profound and, frankly, terrifying. Everything depends on one day. Your entire future hinges on your performance between 9 a.m. and 12 p.m. next March.
What are the deep-seated psychological costs of operating under that kind of sustained, singular pressure for years?
The cost is huge. It manifests in several really damaging ways. First, an intense, almost debilitating fear of failure because the stakes are just so high. Second, a heavy reliance on rote memorization. They learn that the safest, most efficient path to success is just replicating known material, not deep engagement.
And crippling exam day anxiety.
Crippling exam day anxiety, of course. But the most insidious habit, the one you mentioned earlier, is risk avoidance.
How does that actually play out in a daily classroom, especially when they move to a new system?
Risk avoidance means they learn that silence and safety are prized above intellectual experimentation. They become cautious, quiet, and deeply resistant to trying anything unconventional, even if it's a more efficient or elegant way to solve a problem.
Can you give us a concrete scenario?
Sure. Imagine a student from this background is in a new science class, and they're asked to just sketch a conceptual diagram on the board to explain a process. A state board-conditioned student might refuse, even if they know the answer conceptually.
Why?
Because they're afraid their sketch won't be perfect. They're afraid that the process of trying will expose a temporary lack of clarity. They hold back their curiosity because it might lead them down a path that isn't guaranteed to give them the one right examinable answer on the day that matters most.
So they learn that silence is safer than a visible, imperfect attempt.
Profoundly. The system teaches them to be excellent proofreaders of existing knowledge, not excellent creators of new knowledge.
And now these students transition into a system that uses continuous low-stakes assessment, like an IB or a reformed CBSE structure. The shock must be immediate.
It's immediate and intense. They were geared up for one massive annual battle, like a siege. Now they feel like they're constantly under surveillance, constantly being poked and prodded.
So the frequent low-stakes evaluation is misinterpreted.
It's misinterpreted as constant punitive judgment. They see a 7 out of 10 on a quick homework check, not as 70% mastered, but as I failed to be perfect again. They have no conceptual framework for low-stakes failure being beneficial data.
And things like self-reflection, which is mandatory in a lot of these continuous systems, must feel completely terrifying for them.
It is. Reflection requires vulnerability. It requires admitting a flaw in your process, owning a mistake. In their old system, mistakes were existential threats, so their psychological response is often just bewilderment. They say, "Why am I always being assessed? I spent years preparing for the one big test. I need time to study in secret before the final performance."
That's a really important question. If we introduce frequent, low-stakes assessment to these students, does it actually feel low stakes to them, given their years of conditioning?
That's the crucial challenge. No, it does not feel low stakes at first. That pressure conditioning has to be unlearned gently and usually over many months. You can't just flip a switch and say, this doesn't count. You have to actively decondition the anxiety.
So what are the most effective strategies for that? How do you gently shift that conditioning?
First, you introduce frequent but extremely low-stakes quizzes. And I mean quizzes that count for 0% or maybe 1% of the total grade. They are purely for practice. But the key is the language you use around them. You have to emphasize verbally and structurally every single time that they do not count significantly.
So you rebrand them.
You rebrand them. You call them mastery checks or feedback generators, not quizzes or tests. Second, you have to discuss mistakes openly and normalize them as necessary data points for learning, not judgments on their character or intellect.
Like a mistake of the week.
A mistake of the week is a great strategy. The teacher openly discusses a common, complex error from the last assignment, anonymizes the student, and frames it as a moment of group learning. You teach them that getting something wrong today is the quickest path to getting it right tomorrow.
You're consciously shifting the emotional weight away from that single outcome.
Absolutely. Your language has to focus on the process, on effort, on mastery, on how much they've improved since last week. You have to consciously reduce the emotional centrality of the final exam. These students are incredibly adaptable, but that conditioned anxiety, it needs to be dissolved with immense compassion, consistency, and the structural transparency.
Okay, we've spent a lot of time on the high-stakes, low-frequency systems. Let's pivot now to the model of continuous evaluation, which is really exemplified by systems like the International Baccalaureate, the IB. Many people see this as the gold standard.
Yes, and the IB system defines assessment using formative check-ins, summative tasks, crucial internal assessments, or IAs, and very detailed rubrics. The key thing is that the assessment is ongoing. It's completely integrated into the learning process itself.
Can you explain a bit more about those internal assessments, the IAs?
Sure, the IA is a mandated, long-form, self-directed research project or practical work. It's assessed internally by the teacher, but then it's moderated externally to ensure standards. This fundamentally changes the student's focus from just a single, final written exam to a sustained, multi-month academic investigation where the process is just as important as the final product.
That sounds inherently supportive. And when students and parents first encounter the IA system, they often do see it as less stressful than the traditional boards. Why is that initial perception of ease so common?
Well, there are legitimate reasons for that. Students get regular, frequent feedback loops. They have multiple opportunities to correct and improve over time. And because the final grade is spread out across so many different components, IAs, exams, presentations, they experience much less exam shock.
It's built around practice, not performance.
Exactly. The whole system is built around iterative practice, not one final do-or-die performance. So learning feels inherently supportive and scaffolded.
But, and there's always a but.
Yeah.
Here is where we need to apply that critical mentor's warning. Continuous assessment, while it might be philosophically superior in many ways, it carries its own distinct set of unique stress points.
The invisible pressure.
The invisible pressure. And if we're not conscious of this, we're just trading one type of acute anxiety for another type of chronic exhaustion. So what are these unique stressors in a high-frequency, continuous system?
The first one is constant cognitive load. The deadlines truly never stop. There is always a reflection due, a draft that needs perfecting, a bibliography to clean up, a rubric descriptor that has to be met. The sheer volume of it all creates this perpetual background stress.
It's like running on a treadmill that never stops versus sprinting 100 meters once a month.
That is the perfect analogy. Both are taxing, but in fundamentally different ways. The second stressor is continuous evaluation. This persistent sense that you are always being watched or assessed, even when you're just drafting ideas.
That must be a profound drain.
It is. It can erode a student's capacity for unstructured, joyful learning. They might feel they can never just pick up a book for curiosity's sake or explore a topic without immediately trying to map it back to a grading criterion. It feels less like a genuine academic pursuit and more like a permanent state of high-level project management.
And reflection, while it's so beneficial for developing metacognition, thinking about your own thinking, it adds another layer of mental and administrative burden to an already full plate.
It does. And for students who are prone to perfectionism, and continuous assessment tends to attract and reward highly organized perfectionists, this constant stream of requirements leads to the feeling, I can never switch off. There is always another thing to optimize.
So burnout becomes the primary risk.
Burnout, emotional exhaustion, and chronic procrastination because they're overwhelmed. These become the primary psychological risks. It's not the traditional fear of singular failure anymore.
So if continuous assessment is meant to reduce stress, but it leads to burnout, isn't that just trading the acute high stress of one day for the constant pervasive stress of every day? Is the system really superior if the student is still exhausted?
That's the critical challenge that teachers have to address. The superiority is in the potential for deep, transferable learning, but that potential is so easily undermined by poor implementation. Continuous systems become toxic. They fail the child when the surrounding environment amplifies the pressure instead of buckering it.
Can you give us some examples of how that pressure gets amplified?
Sure. First, when parents or teachers micromanage every single deadline and every step, they turn the supportive scaffolding of the IA process into this rigid cage of external control. The student loses all autonomy, and the learning just becomes compliance.
And second, when perfectionism just dominates the student's process.
Yes. When they spend 100 hours on a low-stakes assignment that was designed to take 5, simply because they're aiming for a perfect score on every single descriptor.
That fear of rubric loss, the obsession with hitting every descriptor no matter the cost, that's a huge drain on their mental resources.
It is. The system fails when children become so obsessed with the mechanics of the evaluation with the score that rest and downtime and genuine intellectual exploration are just ignored in favor of optimization. Continuous assessment without a conscious emphasis on balance creates structural exhaustion, and we have to recognize that as a failure of system management, not a personal failure of the student.
So when does it succeed? When does continuous assessment truly work and become this supportive, sustained growth engine?
It truly works when the entire assessment environment is intentionally designed to be learning-centric, not egocentric. The teacher's focus has to be on treating feedback solely as guidance for the next iteration, not as a final judgment on the student's ability or their worth.
And that requires cultural consistency.
It does. It means actively reframing mistakes as necessary moments of growth, not as deficiencies.
And protecting their autonomy.
Yes. You must consciously protect student autonomy in managing their continuous workload. You teach them time management and prioritization skills. You say, this IA draft is due Friday, but you have 3 days off. How will you intentionally schedule rest? Rather than just dictating schedules, you have to help them develop self-compassion.
So the focus has to be on balance over total output.
The goal is depth of understanding and sustained intellectual well-being over the quantity of high scores. A successful IB student is the one who knows how to prioritize sleep over getting a 7 out of 7 on a minor reflection paper. We, as their mentors, have to model that wisdom.
This has been an incredibly insightful deep dive into how these radically different assessment structures, from high-finality state boards to continuous IB systems, really condition students psychologically. If we're going to move forward as conscious teachers, our focus has to be on building resilience against the assessment shock itself.
Absolutely. The assessment systems are just tools. The resilience of the student is the true measure of our success. Before a student changes boards, or even before you as a teacher implement a major change in your own classroom assessment style, we have to train the student to analyze their own emotional response to judgment.
A pre-transition checklist.
A pre-transition checklist focusing on emotional recovery. We need to make the student self-aware of their inner response to performance pressure.
What are those critical questions we should be training them to answer about their own resilience?
First, how do you handle day-to-day feedback? Do you instantly internalize it and act on it, or do you dismiss it as irrelevant or unfair? Second, how do you react emotionally to failure? Do you spiral into self-criticism and anxiety, or do you see the mistake as neutral data, something that makes you curious about the cause of the error?
That distinction, spiraling versus analyzing, that's everything.
It is. And maybe most practically. Can you recover emotionally and move on quickly after an assessment? Whether it's a quick quiz or a major final, the resilient learner treats that result as history within a few hours. The non-resilient learner allows that judgment to define their mood, their self-worth, and their productivity for days or even weeks.
So if they can answer those three questions honestly and positively, if they can accept feedback, analyze failure neutrally, and recover quickly, then they have the foundation they need for any system.
They do. The resilient learner isn't the one with the highest grades in one specific conditioned environment. It's the one who can accept feedback robustly, handle pressure, whether it's the high-stakes finality of a state board or the constant frequency of continuous evaluation, and learn robustly from their mistakes. That child has the adaptability to succeed in any system, CBSE, state board, IB, or whatever technological revolution reshapes education next.
So what does this all mean for us as aspiring teachers moving into a world where curricula and assessment are always changing? Our mission is ultimately bigger than the syllabus.
It has to be. Look, assessment systems will inevitably change again. Technology will certainly shift the measuring stick. Our mission, therefore, is not to prepare the child for the current report card. It's not to make sure they are perfectly adapted to the current board exam. Our mission is to build a profound foundation of mental and emotional resilience.
A quiet inner confidence.
A quiet inner confidence that allows them to adapt, to pivot, and to thrive when the external rules change.
That is a truly powerful thought to leave with our listeners today. Prepare the child, not just the report card.
Absolutely. Because at the end of the day, exams don't actually break children. Sudden, unexplained, or opaque changes in how they are judged. That's what breaks them. And we as teachers must lead with clarity, with compassion, and with psychological awareness. We have to make sure the rules of the game are always transparent, that curiosity is valued above caution, and that their resilience remains the most highly prized outcome of all.